All right, we can go ahead and begin. Welcome everyone to today's shadowing session. We have Jordan Rice today with us, and she'll be talking about clinical trials. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jordin Rice. I am a clinical trials nurse in Houston. I'm just going to give this presentation today just to talk about kind of the different things that you can do in the field and you can do in medicine in general. We'll go ahead and get started. I'll give you a little bit of a background on things as well as kind of how you get into the field, what I do every day, and more details about that. My background, I was a former EMT. I worked when I was in high school into college. I really liked that, and I got to work with nurses a lot. So I decided to pursue my bachelor's in nursing. I was a cardiology and a pulmonary nurse when I first became a nurse for about a year and a half or so. And then I eventually went to research last year during the fall. So I really enjoy research. I always have. I did not necessarily like it as much in school as I do now in practice. And that's for a few different reasons. In school, like research is not as interesting as it is in person. You don't get to see the lasting impacts that it has. So clinical trials, I also didn't learn about it a lot when I was in college and in nursing school. Clinical trials are somewhat complex from the outside. It really is a broad field. You could do clinical trials on really simple things, or you can do it on very complex and rare diseases. I do clinical trials on a rare disease called pulmonary arterial hypertension, meaning it's basically constriction of the pulmonary artery in the lungs. It makes it really hard for patients to breathe, and it really shortens their lifespan. Most patients only live about 7 years after they're diagnosed. So clinical trials for rare diseases like cancer, for the disease I work with, and many other diseases are really important because they're what are giving patients treatment in the future. So every drug that has ever come to market has to go through the clinical trial process. Today, clinical trials can be pretty complex. They last multiple years. They have multiple phases, and I'll talk to you a little bit about those different phases just to give you an overview. Phase 1 basically just determines the safety of a drug. It's tested a lot on animals during that phase. Phase 2, you're basically testing if the drug's even effective. So you know that it's safe, you know it's not going to kill a patient, but is it actually going to work? Is it going to do the job that it's meant to do? Phase 3, you get a little bit more complex. You start to learn more about what dosage is the most therapeutic, and some more safety elements of the drug itself. And you can compare it to other treatments too and see how effective it is. If it's not very effective, there's really not a reason it should come to market. And including if it has a lot of side effects, it doesn't need to come to market either. You could have the perfect drug that in 90% of people it cures cancer, but in 10% it kills, and that's just too large of a percentage to allow to come to market. So those kind of drugs would not be allowed. And they're not going to be FDA approved. So clinical trials basically get things FDA approved. It's a really long process. I work primarily with the phase 2 and 3 studies. So it's going to be a few years in those phases alone, and probably much longer to get FDA approved. I also like the field because it keeps things really interesting. I'm working with new products every day, and things that are not necessarily well known. A lot of what I work with is confidential, so it's hard to share what I'm currently working on, but I can tell you more about the field itself. So next slide. Research takes time. That's one of the biggest things with this field. It takes about 15 years to get a drug FDA approved and to market. So that means stuff that we are approving now was discovered basically in 2005 and sometimes earlier. basically, we will start with a lot of different drugs in phase 1 trials. They don't work, they don't do well, and it kind of gets, there's less compounds that we test in the future. And that keeps going and going until we basically have one compound. And I have a lot of questions that are coming in, and I can answer those now. I'd rather answer them now than at the end. What drove me to the career? I really love research. I love kind of new things all the time. I always want to be ahead of science and also advanced science. I've been interested in that for a long time. And research studies that I've done recently, I've been writing a few grants personally, but the research projects that I've been working on at work with pulmonary hypertension have to do with getting certain drugs FDA approved. And I'll talk about some of that later. What are some challenges that I faced during my career? It's really hard to become a research nurse early in your career, and I'll talk about that in the future. And I'll talk a little bit about the education as well. You really don't need additional education to become a research nurse and work in clinical trials. My biggest advice for people looking to get into the field that already have a nursing degree or are already pursuing a nursing degree is to network. You got to know a few different things about yourself and about what you want to work with. And I'll get into that in just a little bit too. There's no different education programs though. So if you went to nursing school, you can, once you graduate, become an ICU nurse, you can become a research nurse, you can become a home health nurse. There's a lot of variety with that. So if you want to do a lot of different things, nursing is a really good option, but it's also not the only option. You can do clinical trials as a physician. You'll be the principal investigator for studies. I'm not the principal investigator for studies because I don't have a higher level degree. And I'll go into a little bit more about clinical trials in just a minute. I want to talk a little bit about the history of trials themselves. It traditionally has a pretty rough history. I know there's some experiments that you might have heard of, the Tuskegee syphilis study, the thalidomide tragedy. HeLa cells are also used to this day. A lot of these were done on patients without consent. That's really tragic because nobody deserves to be a guinea pig. Clinical trials are about so much more than testing things on people. It's about a mutual benefit between patients and then providers. So I really do encourage you to read more about these events and kind of the history that brought us to where we are. It's interesting if you're interested in medicine at all. And I am going to go to the next slide. I'm just going to discuss a little bit of terminology. I saw some people ask some questions about studies and some that have a little bit of vocabulary in it. We primarily, the gold standard is placebo-controlled, double-blinded studies, meaning that double-blinded being that the physician, the study team, the patient, nobody knows if you're on the medication or not. So usually in trials, there's two groups. There's 50% that are in the placebo group, and there's 50% that are actually on the medicine that we're testing. We do placebo-controlled trials because we want to see if there's a difference in these two groups. So people who are on the placebo, when we look at certain parts of their medical care, their labs, some of the pressures in their heart from a right heart cath, we expect that placebo group to either not change or get worse. The mind is really strong though. Some people have side effects from placebo. So there's some things that are associated with placebos, but it won't make a disease better because it's basically a sugar pill. And then the 50% that's in the medication group, again, nobody knows what group the patients are in until the end of the study. But in that group that's getting the medicine, we want to see if their pressures are getting better, if they're walking further, if they're feeling better, and also what side effects they're having, because if they're having horrible side effects, the gain in that is also not worth it. Control groups in research are people who don't get the experiment. So people who are getting a placebo are the control group. I talked a little bit about the double and single blinded. Single blind is when the patient is blinded, but we're not. So I know if the patient's on placebo or not. Informed consents, that's the consent that we use to introduce and consent people in research. So they sign these consents and they understand the risks associated with research. Everybody has to sign a consent and everybody has to understand and be informed of the research that we're doing. Protocols are basically what we follow as research nurses and as principal investigators of how to do a trial. They're very specific. You have to be really organized and understand a lot of things about the nuances of the protocol in order to run a trial. These are the amount of visits somebody has, the amount of blood draws somebody has, the amount of money they can get from being in a trial. So there's a lot of differences that come with that. But protocols are really important. It's basically the Bible for research, clinical trial research to be specific. Who benefits from clinical trials? I know that clinical trials, if you are younger and in a healthy age range, you've probably been recruited for something before and you get like a $25 gift card. The clinical trials that are for diseases and for patients who are struggling with diseases are a little bit different. There's some benefits that are more expansive. So a lot of patients will get bigger stipends. You get $75 per visit for a total of, a few $1,000s during the study. Also, all your medical care is covered. And medical care can be really expensive, especially for people who don't have insurance. And especially for rare disease, that's the hope you have of hopefully fighting, fixing, or curing whatever disease you have. We get a benefit from running clinical trials. We do get income from trials, and we also get publishing recognition, especially if we are published on a huge drug discovery. It's really beneficial for the academic institution that you work for. I see some people asking questions about any major clinical trials like the COVID vaccines. I was not a part of that. I was not a part of that vaccine trial, but there are trials that I didn't work on directly, but we had at the hospital for different infusions on really sick patients with COVID to hopefully lessen the immune response of interleukin-6 is what we were looking at. And I see more questions coming in. What are ways to get involved with clinical research through high school and college? And what are some common obstacles you face throughout trials with different demographics? That's a really good question. Getting involved early, you can volunteer for trials, but it's really not the same. I honestly recommend just reading about the history of clinical trials and research and how informed consents were made. There's a book about Henrietta Lacks that's really, really good. I really recommend just kind of looking into those things before you decide to go into the field because they're the most important. And then about demographics for trials, it's really important that we have diverse patients. If you have all patients that look the same, that are the same gender, the same race, your trials will not work on a diverse population in the long run. So when drugs are going through trials, we have them on a diverse population in order to make sure it works for a large group in the future. And I'm going to go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the day-to-day. I see patients on a few days of the week, so maybe 3 out of the 5 days of the week because I work Monday through Friday. I have a pretty consistent schedule, which I really like. I worked on the floor previously as a nurse. That was 12-hour shifts, 3 days a week. That really was hard on me and my body. And having weekends off in research is really nice. I also don't have any on-call shifts. I know a lot of people in healthcare have that. I have about 50% patient facing. So I actually work with patients almost every day. I had a patient in clinic earlier today for several hours. I mean, I'm drawing blood, I'm processing labs, I'm performing some tests on them, like a 6-minute walk, an EKG, pretty normal tasks. And also 50% is regulatory work. So like writing informed consents. We have research meetings and also work with approval boards that review all the consents that we write. So we get we get a lot of feedback from a lot of different groups on how we can do research better. And somebody asked a question, how are clinical trials funded? That's actually a really, really good question. Clinical trials are funded by what we call a sponsor company. So these are the people that create a drug. Say, I work with Johnson & Johnson, or Merck is also a pretty common company. Those companies will write a protocol, will give us a drug, and also ask us to participate in a trial if they see that we're a good center for a certain disease or have a large patient population. So we get all of the money from clinical trials through these big companies and pharmaceutical companies. So it's a pretty money-fueled field to get drugs to market, but we also have to do this ethically, where we treat patients fairly, where we give them proper medical care, and we're very thorough in the trials. And hopefully when drugs get approved, they can help patients in the future. A little bit about the career, I just want to go over some pros and cons. You have to be really organized. You have to be pretty on top of reading everything that comes at you. You have to understand nuances and things and be pretty detail oriented. You have a lot of responsibility and a lot of things you have to juggle. I have to schedule patients on multiple different days, working with their schedule, a physician's schedule, and also my schedule. And we also have to make sure we're organized. So, 5 years from now, if we wanted to look back at data, we could access it pretty easily and understand what we were doing at that time. Somebody asked, why do clinical trials take so long to complete? And this is for multiple reasons. Sometimes it's really hard to recruit patients for things, if it's a rare disease especially. Sometimes you don't have enough participants and you don't want to publish data on a small participant group. You need a pretty large group to have a statistical correlation or relevance. And also they're expensive. Discovering drugs is really hard, and it's also can be an unsafe process. So that time is very geared towards safety. But on the other hand, if you had something like the COVID pandemic, if we had the amount of money and resources and time that the pandemic had to, create a vaccine for COVID, a lot of diseases would be cured. They had so much funding, so many researchers on it. So there are things that can be expedited in very special cases. And I'll go over the new advancements and technologies. I know somebody asked that question that I've been a part of, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. If you are currently in medicine, talk to people that are in research, get experience with people that are in research, because a network is going to be really important to you. I personally recommend getting experience first if you want to go the clinical route. I didn't know what I wanted to research or what I wanted to be involved with. So since I'm so passionate about the disease I work with, it makes it a lot easier to do the job every day. I'm going to talk a little bit about pulmonary hypertension, the disease that I work with, so we can talk a little bit more about the physiology and the medicine behind it. Basically, it's a really rare disease, and it's different from normal hypertension. So normal hypertension, you're going to have high blood pressure in your body. Pulmonary arterial hypertension is high blood pressure in the pulmonary artery, which can cause a ton of different problems. So since your pulmonary artery is really constricted, the blood flow to your lungs is severely decreased. This causes a ton of problems. It can cause shortness of breath. You can't even walk up the stairs. You can't make your bed. You'll have chest pain. You might faint. And it also causes really severe heart failure over time. So if you don't have treatment for it, you will likely die in the next few years. It is really rare. However, it is more common in females. About 75% of patients we see are females. So since these symptoms are pretty ambiguous and it's hard to diagnose, people get diagnosed late, and it makes it a lot harder to treat because we can't reverse the disease at all. What causes it? There's a few different things that can cause it, and there's a few things we really don't know about. There's something called idiopathic pulmonary hypertension, which basically means we don't know what causes it. It's we have nothing to attribute it to. You can also inherit it. It can be passed down in the family. There's also autoimmune diseases like Sjogren's that cause it, drug-induced, so methamphetamine or even diet pills that were around in the 80s. We see some patients that took a medicine called fen-phen, and that also has caused this disease. It can also be caused by heart failure and respiratory disease and HIV. So there's a ton of things that can cause it. So sometimes it can be really hard to pin down exactly where a patient developed this. We primarily diagnose it through a right heart cath. That's the gold standard for diagnosing PAH. Basically, we thread a catheter into somebody's neck or groin, float it into the heart, and we can see how large the pressure is in the pulmonary artery and other areas of the heart. We also use other tests that are less invasive, like an ultrasound of your heart called an echocardiogram. That's usually the first time people are aware they might have a problem with PAH. And then they're referred to hopefully a specialist that can diagnose them sooner. We treat it with medications that basically dilate your pulmonary artery. So when this constricts, if we can open it up more, it'll allow more blood to get to the lungs. It will decrease the pressures and hopefully make your life a little bit easier to live. I will go to the next slide. Some of the treatments, we have some treatments that were FDA approved. I work a lot with each of these drugs. There are pills that you can take, there are inhalers that you can take, and there's also infusions that are available. These basically are in the order of the least to most severe disease. So if you don't have a very poor risk, or if you don't have a really high risk case, if your PA pressure is somewhat normal, somewhat elevated, you're not having a lot of symptoms, you could probably get by on pills, and we can use a combination therapy. And then there's more intense medications that are inhaled, and the most intense, which would be Remodulin or Velletri. These are either subcutaneous or intravenous medications. You have to have an IV hooked up to you for the rest of your life, essentially. Some patients can be transplanted depending on their case, but that's really rare for most pulmonary hypertension patients. So we have to rely on these medicines and clinical trials to help them in the future. Somebody asked me why I chose pulmonary hypertension specifically, and that's a really good question. Not a lot of people have heard about this disease, so it makes clinical trials a lot more time sensitive, important to pursue. And also the disease affects a lot of young women, and I really empathize with people who are my age and have a basically life-threatening condition. It's almost more terminal than cancers, and it's just really hard to watch people go through, but also it's really strong patients that I have loved taking care of when I was a bedside nurse. Some of the things we go through when we're diagnosing this, I'm just giving you a background so we can talk more about kind of the trials that we're doing now to hopefully reverse the condition or help it in the future. Diagnosing pulmonary hypertension is really hard. We have to look at symptoms, and hopefully somebody is referred to get a echocardiogram, which is that ultrasound of your heart. And if that ultrasound shows that you have a high PA pressure, you're going to go get a few different tests. A more common medical condition that this disease is confused with a lot is pulmonary embolisms, which is a blood clot in your heart or lungs, or sometimes it can go to your brain, which is a stroke, an ischemic stroke. But it's hard to know what that is. So we have to do more tests. So you have to go from the most likely thing. So if somebody came into my clinic and was really, really short of breath during activity, there's things like asthma, or some people even get short of breath with anxiety. You want to cancel out those things and rule them out before you go straight to a right heart cath, because that's a pretty invasive test. It's not comfortable. It takes about a day to recover from. You're getting in basically a catheter through your neck. It's can be really scary for patients. So any kind of non-invasive scan we can do is really good to diagnose people. I will go to the next slide. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of just a question so people kind of get some exposure to what I'm talking about when we're diagnosing people. So let's say a 42-year-old female is having shortness of breath the past few months and can't walk up the stairs. Her oxygen saturation is 97, which is normal. Blood pressure is a little elevated, and their heart rate is 94, which is within normal. It's on the higher side. And they're having respirations of 22. What test are you going to recommend for this patient? So since I work with PAH, the gold standard for diagnosing that would be a right heart cath, but we can't automatically assume people have the rarest disease. So we would actually go for something that's less invasive, like a chest CT. So you take a picture, a CAT scan of their chest, see if they have any blood clots or anything like that. That would be the first line. And if they didn't, then you would maybe get an echocardiogram and then a right heart cath. So I'm going to talk about one of the clinical trials that we worked with that has recently been approved. So Tyvaso was approved in 2019. Basically, this is the inhaled version of the IV drug that a lot of patients are on. It's called treprostinil. Basically, it's 4 doses a day on this big machine. They have to carry this machine with them. They have to travel with it. If you go on vacation out of town, you have to bring this with you and all the medication with you. It can be kind of cumbersome, but it's a really good alternative to having a continuous infusion where you can't swim, you can't do anything with. So this medication doesn't work for everybody. Some people still have to be on the IV version, but it was a great revolution in patients that have this disease, because now they don't have to be hooked up to an IV. Going on, the new inhaler that was developed is the same medication, but much, much smaller. It's about the size of a thumb, really, really small. It's a lot easier to carry with you. And it might be approved next year, just depending on some regulatory things. It has to go through the FDA, and it's being done right now. But the main reason it has to be approved is because we need to know that it works the same as that bigger inhaler. We need to know if people have the same benefit or if it's less effective or more effective. Right now, everything suggests that it's pretty much the same as the nebulizer, the big machine, but it's just smaller. So that's one of the benefits. And, you have to ask yourself, how do you think this device would benefit patients? If you went on vacation and you only had to bring something that could fit in your hand, that's a lot easier than something that has to have its own suitcase. And it's easier to carry with you. You're probably going to be taking it more regularly and be more compliant. since you don't have to be at home to take it, or it's a lot easier to carry with you. So that's one thing we were working on. It's from United Therapeutics, and I definitely recommend looking into some of the clinical trials they have now. They're working on growing lungs out of patients' bodies, which is really interesting. They're using a lot of gene therapy and techniques that I, way over my head, I don't know a lot about, I can't speak about, but it's a very interesting company. So definitely look into that. I'm gonna go to case study number 2. This is a condition that we deal with quite a bit. So patients will come in, like this patient that's listed, have a clotting disorder, and when we do a right heart cath, they have a really high pulmonary artery pressure. The patient had evidence of clotting in their lungs, and through an echo and a CT and a VQ scan, all of that was positive, showing that they had a history of blood clots. So this is a type of pulmonary hypertension that we can actually do surgery on. It's called chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension, or CTEPH. So we can actually do surgery on these patients. And it's a pretty gnarly surgery because we have to basically put them on a heart-lung bypass and open up their chest and take out all the blood clots. And I'll kind of show you a picture of that. This is kind of a picture of what we would take out of somebody's pulmonary arteries. It's kind of crazy. And you can look up videos or pictures of it online. They're really interesting to watch, the surgeries. But this is just an example of some of the people that we deal with and how complex like a rare disease like this would be. We have clinical trials in these patients as well, but since it's a different type of pulmonary hypertension, it has to be treated differently. So these patients would be on something like blood thinners, a little less invasive. A lot of them have higher pulmonary artery pressure, so they are on the other medications I talked about, like these right here. So that's pretty much the end of my presentation as far as pulmonary hypertension, but I'm just gonna go through a few of the questions I got about clinical trials. In order to get any drug to market, we have to do a clinical trial on it, and we have to test that it's safe in patients. So one last example I have of that, if you look here on the right side of the screen, it talks about the IV medications. They're called Deletri and Remodulin. So they're actually implanted. There's a catheter that's indwelling in people's chest, or sometimes a subcutaneous one that can be in their arm or stomach. That has to be there forever. It's constantly infusing medicine. It can have a lot of side effects, but it usually helps patients that are in late stage disease. So I will show you kind of more about that and kind of where we're going to help patients in the future that are struggling with pulmonary hypertension. Currently, Remodulin, the drug on the left, goes through this pump and is infusing through your chest. It's really great for patients that have a severe disease or severe pulmonary hypertension, and it was approved in 2002 to treat patients with PAH. So these patients have to basically be on this medication forever. It's really not recommended to come off of. If you do come off, you might have a lower life expectancy and a lot of complications with that. But it does improve people's lives, like they can walk up and down the stairs. It increases the amount of time they're living since their disease isn't necessarily worsening while they're on it. So it's helpful, but you know, people have a lot of infections from the line. They might bolus themselves, meaning they're giving themselves way too much medication because they have to manage this pump on their own. You won't have a nurse or a doctor with you at all times. You have to be really competent about your medical care. And on the right is a potentially new device, a pump that's implanted into a patient's chest, constantly infusing like the other one, but you have a lot lower risk of any kind of infection or any kind of issues with the line, which is really awesome. We had a patient a few months ago that their wife accidentally cut their line with scissors when they were doing a dressing change, and they had to come to the hospital and get a whole new line placed, which is pretty invasive. So something like this would be really, really amazing for patients that struggle with infections or struggle with managing their lines. So I'm going to just answer a few of the last questions as we wrap up here. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. And I can talk about, somebody asked what advancements and new technologies have been developed over the past few years. And I talked about a few of them. I wasn't necessarily on any of the trials that I talked about, but these are trials in the field that I work in. We work with one of these trials directly, and it's exciting to see patients that improve from it. And it's really exciting to see when people get to do well, their medical care is covered by these companies. They have the opportunity to be a part of history and discovering something that hopefully will cure the disease one day. Somebody asked what the average day in the field looks like and kind of how COVID has affected it. I was a nurse at the bedside during the beginning of the pandemic, but during the past 8 months, I've transitioned to this research role. Basically, COVID shut it down for a little bit and people were working from home, but that did not last very long. We had patients that we needed to see that needed to come in for research. There's an ambulance in the background because I'm at the medical center right now. But COVID has impacted patients being diagnosed with the disease because, they didn't come into clinic or they didn't go to a regular doctor's office because they were scared. So some people are being diagnosed a little bit later in their disease state. And that goes with a ton of different diseases right now. But COVID, we have to take regular precautions, especially if people are on a trial for an inhaler. You have to, step out of the room if they're taking the medicine, or you might have more home visits or things like that, and they don't come to clinic as much. But most of my patients still come to clinic regularly. COVID has not impacted it too much now. What are ways to get involved with clinical research, and kind of how do you get involved with it once you're already in medicine? It can be tough to get a network, but a lot of physicians, if you're not training to be a medical doctor, a lot of physicians do work with research and clinical trials because it's good for their academic, anything they're pursuing in academics. So they need research nurses with them because research nurses will do a lot of the patient contact, the blood draws, a lot of the work, legwork around the trial. But the physicians will be the advisors for it. They'll make all the critical decisions. If you want to go up on somebody's dose of medication or go down, or if they get admitted to the hospital because of something, you want to have that oversight. And a lot of people asked why I wanted to go into clinical trials, and what my favorite part about it is. I really think that clinical trials is the interesting and the hope-giving business in medicine. We have patients that really don't have any option. They're on every therapy they can be on. They've done everything they can, and they're living with a disease that has really no cure. So having a clinical trial is a chance to hopefully find a medicine that makes that better, and they don't have to live with something that will eventually kill them. So it's really exciting to see people get better and live a long time. I have one patient that she was diagnosed in the 90s, and she's still just on oral medications because she's been doing so well on them. And we have some patients, that are diagnosed when they're 18. They're immediately on this IV drug, and that's it. They just have a really progressive and fatal disease. So clinical trials, we're trying to get more medicines out there that actually reverse the disease. And there's 2 that I have trials with now that actually hopefully will reverse the disease itself instead of just treating the symptoms. So that's just a few of the exciting things that I'm working on currently, and reasons why I love the field. Somebody asked if I ever assist other medical professionals during live procedures. I don't really participate in that on the research side. I have the opportunity to see things if I wanted to. I'm sure if I wanted to see the PTE surgery, the of that embolus that I showed you a picture of, this over here, I'm sure I could get in on watching that surgery, but I don't assist them directly. If you are interested in assisting like actual surgical procedures, nurses can do that, but you have to have a certification for it. It's called RNFA. You're an RN First Assist. So I'm not particularly interested in participating in surgeries, never really was my thing. But if you are and you don't necessarily want to be a surgeon, that's also a good opportunity. And a lot of people just kind of asked, what nursing field or a study I did. It's the regular study. I just did regular nursing school. I was a bedside nurse for almost 2 years, and then I decided to go into research after working with a physician that I really love on the floor with the patients I worked with. And he basically gave me the opportunity to work in research, and I took it because I knew I wanted to be here. So that's basically the end of my presentation. If anybody has questions about this or wants to talk more about clinical trials, I am on Instagram. My name is just Jordin Rice. I'll go back up to the first slide. But I would love to answer questions you have about it, see if there's any way I can help you get more involved in the field, give you book recommendations, whatever you need to educate yourself on how to participate more in this, because it's really important and I'm glad people are interested in it. So thank you all for listening. I'm hopefully help somebody, and if you need anything in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Jordin. It was really great to have you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for this. I hope that people can, watch it in the future if they decided not to get on the live today and get to learn more. Yeah.
Yeah. And for everyone who's still watching, make sure to fill out the Google Forms and turn it in by 6:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But other than that, yeah, thank you so much.